Thanks, Raf, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for the Hopkins family for the invitation. Society does not consist of individuals, but expresses the sum of interrelations, the relations within which these individuals stand. So that was Karl Marx. Vince Lombardi is an American football coach, and he came to the view that individual commitment to a group effort is what makes teams work and companies and society and civilization working together. It's quite novel, isn't it? Tonight we're here to talk about the society in which we all live, the communities that make up this society, to discuss how society can and does change, to talk about the roles that each of us can play in that process. So you might think this is a bit weird for an engineer, but just bear with me. If I asked around the room tonight for a definition of society, I bet I'd have about, how many people here? About 70 different views. So for the sake of clarity, let's define society as being the aggregate of people in a more or less ordered community. Some of you might think that the society in New Zealand and lots of other places in the world, I suppose, is built on relationships between people in communities of families and friends who are interacting with, caring for, and looking after each other. That's pretty much an idealised view of how we would like to see society. Others might think that modern society is moving more towards being a collection of individuals with a strong focus on themselves, thinking more about what's in it for me and when can I get it, rather than the needs and desires of others. Still others might see society as groups of separate, distinct social, religious or racial groups who are pretty much functioning within themselves with little or no interaction between each other. For the next 45 minutes or so, I'd ask you to set aside any preconceptions that you have and remain open to receive or develop new possibilities for what society could look like. So over the last 7 years or so, I've been exposed to a number of scenarios in which sudden changes to the environment have acted as a catalyst to reawaken the natural behaviours in people to intentionally look out for others in the community. Sitting back and thinking on these experiences, I was left wondering why we needed external influences to actually change society and the way people interacted. This is a photo of the student army. And you'll all remember, if you were here during and after the earthquakes, the Farmy Army and all sorts of different people. These are good examples of people being motivated to step out and do something different. I think if we look at university students today, you probably don't see them out on the weekend helping the community. You probably didn't before the earthquakes either. Tonight you'll hear the story of a pretty basic bloke, that's me, with training as a civil engineer, who was really profoundly impacted by a couple of these scenarios being the earthquake experiences. These experiences brought about a realisation in my mind that it's probably good every now and then to sit back and just think about where society is going as a whole. It's also worth thinking about whether we could challenge ourselves and other people to individually participate and impact communities in which we live more than we do. So I mentioned that I've been trained as a civil engineer. Even though who we are as people is more appropriately defined by the families and cultures that we grow up in, our life experiences, our gender perhaps, or our relationships, we quite often refer to our careers when asked to describe ourselves. It's probably because we spend a lot of time at work and we get a lot of self-worth and value out of doing what we do. So to provide some context as to where the story is being told from tonight, let's just define a couple of terms. So civil engineer, two simple words. Civil, relating to the ordinary citizens and their concerns, as distinct from military and ecclesiastical matters. It's a bit weird. Courteous and polite. Those of you who know engineers can probably relate to that. Engineer itself stems from two Latin words, really to contrive or devise, and cleverness. So if we think about civil engineering, it's maybe the clever application of scientific principles to solve problems for ordinary citizens, maybe. So as an engineer, I think it's highly valuable to consider where the term came from and why it's important. So this chap up here, John Smeaton, in 1771, created this term civil engineer, and he did so to distinguish what he was doing from the military engineering of the day and a lot of engineering that was done for churches who were the power back in the past. So Smeaton designed bridges, harbours, lighthouses. He was a mechanical engineer as well, and he was also an eminent physicist. He and his mates, although they probably didn't call themselves mates, in 1818 got together and created the Institute of Civil Engineers in London. And by 1828, the institution had received a royal charter and was recognised as a profession. Enough of that. Now, if we consider the possibility of changing the L on the end of civil with a C, we get the word civic. So the term civic engineer, it's not well known. In fact, if you Google search it, you won't find it. But for the sake of the lecture, let's just keep going and accept that it's a reality. Two words again, civic, of a town, a city, or the people who live in it. And engineering, again, contrive, devise, and cleverness. Now to the point of this little diversion. Civic engineer is, in my view, a more appropriate description of where I think the civil engineering profession should be heading. The difference to me is about refocusing the contriving of clever solutions towards servicing people rather than on technical engineering challenges at hand, which is where I think a lot of engineers focus. We've become boffins in love with our brilliant technical solutions without an appropriate consideration for the people whom we have created the solutions for, and even maybe whether we're solving the right problem. Hardly earth-shattering, I know, but just bear with me. So now that we've got that out the way, let's just consider for a few seconds, why should you even be sitting here listening to a self-proclaimed engineering boffin? Well, my family and myself have been hopping between the sides of the Tasman since 1983. My wife and my oldest son are Kiwis, and the rest of us are, well, I'm not an Aussie, I'm a foreigner too, but we're Aussies generally. I've been jumping the ditch, getting engaged in engineering and project management projects. Now, in the late 1990s, as Raf alluded to, we got involved in this new phase that was coming out across the contracting industry in Australia called collaborative commercial models. This exposed us to the concept of high-performance teams. And you guys probably think straight away of the All Blacks at this point, and I can't argue at the moment. So these high-performance teams were formed to deliver outstanding outcomes as defined by the goals and objective of our clients. Quite unlike normal contracting of the day, these clients were setting goals for us to deliver in areas of safety and the environment and community and stakeholder engagement. Very, very weird. We were also asked to talk about cost, time and quality, which was what we used to. We were given coaching in collaboration and taught about communication, which was quite counterintuitive for an engineer and a contractor at that. But we were used to focusing on getting stuff done and generally felt that people just got in the way. So communication, community, and collaboration were the first big C's that came crashing in on my career and my comfort zone. Now moving to 2011, Queensland, where I was General Manager for Fulton Hogan, had just had 2 months of cyclonic rains and a lot of flooding. There were over 70 towns that were flooded, 200,000 people dislocated from their homes, 40,000 homes flooded, 35 people died, and 3/4 of the state was declared a disaster zone. That's 1.4 million square kilometres, which is about 5.2 times the size of New Zealand. This was my first exposure to working with communities that have been impacted by disaster events. And I watched as people from all over the state congregated and rushed in to help those worst affected. As a contractor though, trying to get out there and clean up this mess that you see and start rebuilding roads and things, I just thought that the community were getting in the way. But I stopped and thought for a while and noticed that not only were the people being helped really getting something out of it, but the people who'd come to help the others were getting a lot out of the experience. This was my first sort of exposure and it hit me a little bit. So in April 2011, when I got a phone call from the Managing Director asking me would I be interested in coming to Christchurch to help with a bit of work down there, I did what most clever engineers did and said I needed to get back to the boss and I'd get back to him tomorrow. So I went home and spoke to my wife, Ruth. We've got 4 kids and we were in the middle of producing, well we weren't, our kids were, grandkids, and it wasn't really a good time to be leaving. But as luck would have it, Ruth, being a good Kiwi lass, decided that it was a good thing to do to come to her father's hometown and do our bit. She was a counsellor and she got into counselling of people, and I got into joining a bunch of people that would become the Stronger Christchurch Infrastructure Rebuild team. And we commenced what I considered to be a massive infrastructure rebuild program. My former years and engineering training experience was driving me to get stuck in and get things done. But those big C's of communication and community and collaboration came back and gave me a kick in the butt. We'd set up the organisation Skirt for Success by calling in a high-performance coach to help us try and emulate your All Blacks. We were led by quite a far-sighted board that had a big strategic view, which was fantastic. And with their guidance, we set about developing a very intentional set of plans to steer and direct us as we moved forward. We created a vision and values and defined behaviours to drive a culture that was focused on the delivery of outcomes for the people of Christchurch. We created a whole lot of measures and we started measuring our performance and got into it as good engineers do. We harnessed people from 8 different organisations to create a new purpose-built business founded on collaboration, and we got stuck in. However, within about 2 or 3 weeks of getting out and about in the community, I came face to face with the realisation that people were still missing the basic intrinsic necessities of life, like drinking water and sewerage systems that worked and road networks that enabled you to travel. At that point, I had what I call my epiphany. I realised that this was a community rebuilding program. It wasn't just about infrastructure. So I'd taken my first steps on the journey to becoming a civic engineer and was able to clearly appreciate that we needed to consider a different approach. We weren't about to throw away all the good stuff that we knew from delivering major infrastructure projects around the place. We needed those procedures and systems and frameworks. We needed to take what we had and add to it. We intentionally sought out experts in fields other than engineering. We wanted to expand our diversity of thought, and we wanted help from people so that we could start to define what we didn't know we didn't know. We connected with people from other rebuild teams, the International Red Cross, the Sarah team, who were just forming, EQC, who were well underway, and then there were the health and school rebuild programs as well. We called in psychologists to help us understand the impact of these earthquakes and ongoing aftershocks on our people and on the community. Help us just understand and lean into that word empathy that I learnt from the Red Cross. We called on experts from leadership theory, economists, people managers, communication experts, and even All Blacks coaches to help us understand how to grow a high-performance team. We connected with community groups, and we quickly did some research into disaster recovery to help us understand where we were on the journey and what we could expect. So this is a really good diagram. The bottom line, the bottom horizontal line reflects time. At the time of a disaster, hopefully you've had some time to get into the disaster risk reduction phase, being prepared and doing some prevention work. I'm not sure we had a lot of that in Christchurch. We then move into the emergency response phase, making safe buildings, saving people's lives, working on that first up emergency response stuff. And then over time you transition into recovery and then into reconstruction. And we're still in reconstruction in Christchurch, I would suggest. From the Red Cross, I gained a better understanding of the different elements of a disaster recovery. It's all founded on the central theme of community. You've got the built environment, which we were getting involved in, building water services and sewerage and roads and the like. But as we were doing that, we were able to influence the economic recovery. We intentionally did things like employed 20% of our workforce from Christchurch, from people outside the industry, and trained them up to help get up more people jobs, people who were unemployed because they'd lost their work. We ensured that we started off with local contractors and suppliers to try and stimulate the local environment. And we were just starting to understand the social component of the recovery, the well-being of the community. We decided that if we were actually intentional about this, we would be able to positively impact all the sectors of the recovery whilst we focused on our infrastructure rebuild or the built environment. So with the big C of community engagement, a central focus in what we did, we upgraded our communications and engagement plan to ensure consistency and clarity of our message. We used a multitude of types of communication to make sure that we connected with all the different walks of the community. So the older people weren't into social media, so we did letterbox drops and newspaper ads and those sort of things. We got into web pages and face-to-face door knocking and community groups, whatever we could to get the message out across the whole of the community. We used independent organisations to survey the community to tell us how we were going, identify areas that we could improve what we were doing. We linked in with the Red Cross to share information. What we discovered is the community opened up to the Red Cross people differently to our people. Who would have thought that the courteous and polite engineer was actually a threat to some people in the way we approached our communication? In time, we brought the Red Cross team into our actual office and we started working with them intentionally on a number of projects aimed at learning from each other and sharing our strengths. We started to look at how we could intentionally build community recovery as we moved across the city. We shamelessly grabbed anyone and everyone to join with us and the community as we celebrated completion of work and the restoration of normality street by street. We sought to empower the community through the provision of timely information and knowledge. Knowledge is power, and people really gained a lot from being told what was going to happen and when. We piggybacked off as many face-to-face community engagement opportunities as we could. We went out and spoke to community gatherings at churches, at old folks' homes, university third age, youth groups, Boy Scouts, whatever we could. And we spoke to a lot of people, but the reality is we didn't get it right all the time. So while we got really good at celebrating success, we sometimes got the balance wrong between developing the best technical solution, and developing the solution that best suited the needs of the community. Sometimes we found that even the same technical solution could be very attractive to some parts in the community, but absolutely unacceptable to others. The pressure wastewater system that we developed for areas in the city with really reactive ground that was subject to lots of movement and liquefaction was a classic example where some people loved it and others hated it. We did have many really good successes in terms of community engagement. We had tools like a 6-month program that we would advertise in the newspaper, put up on the website to tell people where we were going as we progressed through the city. We worked with schools to inform the children, who then went home and informed the adults. We had campaigns to explain to the traffic impacted by our works why they were being impacted, and we tried to reduce frustration by handing out chocolate frogs and doing all sorts of crazy things. We had heaps of direct communication one-on-one with the people in the street, house by house, so that we could try and keep them informed and help make their lives more livable. We learned one thing of great importance: you just can't communicate too much. Whatever you think, you can always communicate more and better. The culture of our internal team was the next big C that we focused on. This is one of our regular team get-togethers that we used to use to inform people and just G up the group and keep people focused and aligned. We built on our existing people and performance plan to focus the entire team on working together to drive best outcomes we could for the people of Christchurch. We developed a focus on the well-being of our team. We needed to make sure that our team was match fit so that they were up and ready to go and work in the community and help them get match fit. We empowered people to have a go and be the very best they could. It's amazing when you give people an opportunity, you give them some direction, and then you tell them to get on with it, how much they can achieve. We called for courage to find new and better ways to do things. Another key area that we focused on was succession planning. We knew that we had to grow new people up because you get tired in disaster recovery. So we brought the thought process in that a good leader and a good manager actually trained his people to do himself out of a job, and eventually they got rid of me. Collaboration was the next big C that we jumped into. The entire Skirt organisation and its connection to industry, the community and government was built on collaboration. First, we had collaboration between central government, local government and NZTA, our 3 client groups. We then had collaboration between 5 major contractors who came together with our clients to create the core of what was Skirt. We were collaborating with over 20 designers to bring in over 300 design team into the business. And we focused on locally living people. We didn't want to bring engineers and consultants in from outside. We needed to stimulate the economy and keep the people of Christchurch working. We also collaborated with over 100 subcontractors and supplier organisations, both locally and across the whole country. There was no single organisation capable of doing what needed to be done, so we just got on and pulled a new one together. We also worked hard to facilitate collaboration across the other rebuild programs that were going on across the city. One successful initiative that we used was to pull together information from the utility providers, the council's sewer and water and the power and the communications. All that information, we then coupled it with all the geotech data we could find, and we put it on a single GIS platform, which we then openly shared with everyone so that we could make sure that we had the most accurate information possible. This stimulated better designs and better construction solutions. We created a platform called the Forward Works Viewer. This is a bit of a snapshot from that. And it's a diagrammatic representation of where we're going to be working street by street over time to give people an understanding of what was going on. We shared this tool with other programs across the city and started to get everyone's information on it. And then we handed it over to Sarah and they took it on. This enabled collaboration, informed scheduling of work. I think it minimised costly rework and hopefully it minimised the impact on the community. These tools were especially useful when we got into the CBD. They pulled the cordons down. We gave ourselves 12 months to do $125 million worth of work to reinstate the services in the city. So we challenged the team to coordinate using tools like the Forward Works Viewer, a rolling program of road closures to keep the traffic moving through the city whilst we were building, whilst we were keeping businesses open, whilst we were coordinating with the other rebuild projects at the same time. And we pretty much achieved that, all through collaboration. We learnt that true collaboration has got to be the situation where the sum of the component parts is greater than the sum of the individuals. So your 1 + 1 = 3. And you only achieve that when you come together and align on your agreed goals and objectives. You then commit to achieving those goals and objectives together. You've got to put your corporate ego and your personal ego to the side and focus on what's the common good. It's quite a challenge to do that, and you need to make sure that you hold people accountable and you almost need to harass people to continue to collaborate. But in time it gained momentum and was a self-perpetuating phenomenon. It was brilliant. It's not always easy, but it is imperative. By the end of 2014, Ruth and I headed back to Australia. We'd grown professionally and personally a lot, and we'd been able to hand over the running of Skirt to one of the team who had grown up and stepped into the role. We got back to normal business life and normal social life, but found it was quite difficult after the cut and thrust of disaster recovery. As luck would have it, in November 2016 there was another earthquake. As you all know, it closed the main traffic routes, rail and road, between Picton and Christchurch, severely impacting movement of people and goods. Fulton Hogan, my employer, asked me would I be interested in coming back to help. They'd been speaking with NZTA and Kiwi Rail and they thought I might be able to add some value. Before we go into Kaikoura, I just want to reflect. Before I'd left Skirt, we'd been working with a team of us within Skirt to look at developing some basic guidelines for a future disaster response, should it be needed. As I said about working with NZTA and Kiwi Rail to consider how best to respond to Kaikoura, it became apparent that a number of the learnings from Christchurch were indeed directly applicable and that we had an opportunity to learn from our previous experience. So armed with a team of people that we moved directly across from Skirt as they were finishing off, and charged up with a bunch of new people full of energy and vigour, we set off on a journey moving mountains to connect communities as the North Canterbury Transport Infrastructure Recovery Team, NECTA. We utilised basically the same principles that we'd used and implemented in Christchurch as we established a new organisation, again founded on collaboration, community and communication. One of the keys to the rapid response that I found in Kaikoura was the legislation and orders in council that was passed by both sides of government in the period between the earthquake in early November and just before Christmas break. The orders in council required the formation of a group called the Restoration Liaison Group, which was tasked with informing the rebuild team as the design and planning were developed. Organisations involved by legislation or through orders in council were iwi, DOC, ECAN, Heritage New Zealand, local councils obviously, NZTA and Kiwi Rail, key community groups and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. I believe that this group was absolutely fundamental in providing a really crucial linkage into local knowledge, experience and most important stakeholder information, whilst ensuring that we were able to feed back to the stakeholders and the legislative parties, feed back to them what we were doing. We were able to listen and then respond to them. Out of this group, a number of key relationships were developed, which fundamentally impacted and challenged a number in the team. In particular, Ngāi Tahu and their organisation dealing with cultural heritage, Mahanui, I found them to be fantastic. They were actually able to be very patient and display a lot of grace as I struggled to understand their culture really, and to treat them in a manner that was going to enable us to move forward. Working in true collaboration means understanding your partner organisations and their method of management and leadership. I learned that there's a unique difference between traditional Western models of management and communication and those of iwi organisations. And I learnt that the types of information and the mode and method of communication needs to be suited specifically for those people that you're talking with as they are in different parts of their organisation. Whilst I was learning this and they were putting up with us dumb Aussie, as they called me, we kept on working together and getting things done and moving forward whilst we were respecting their heritage and moving on. The Nectar team needed to quickly engage with Kaikoura Council to link into the communication connections that they had with the community and local industry. Industry had been decimated by the closure of the motorway. The community was hurting and they just wanted people to get on with it. It was apparent to most people who had actually been out onto the site and seen the damage that there was a huge amount of work that was required to stabilise and make safe the hills and mountains adjacent to the corridor before we could even get going. This was going to need hundreds and hundreds of people. And there was an accommodation challenge. We worked with Kaikoura Council to do a survey of the local accommodation venues in town and identify that there was a 300-bed shortfall. We solved this by securing or buying an industrial accommodation facility in Aussie. A lot of complex sites on that Kaikoura coast. The location includes archaeological areas, bird nesting sites, coastal uplift, a desire by the local community to maintain access to the coastal marine area. The hills adjacent to the road and the rail had slips coming down and they would come down for years. The only solution was to realign the road. After working with all the stakeholders, after propping up caves to protect archaeological sites and to maintain bird nesting areas, we got an alignment that was agreed and we got stuck into it. The team innovated their pants off and that bridge up there was built in 17 weeks through some really smart ways of doing things. And when you get out there and drive on it, you'll see it's no mean feat. The outcome may not have resolved every stakeholder concern, but it provided the best balance that we could get to a number of very complex issues and allowed us to keep moving forward connecting communities. It's fair to say that the speed of the response in Kaikoura in relation to the infrastructure rebuild specifically, which is what I was involved in, was considerably faster than the Christchurch response. I believe that this was achieved to a large degree because of the lessons that we learnt from Christchurch, which were revisited and improved for this response. Once again, built on a foundation of collaboration, communication and community focus. These learnings were seen in central government, the way they approached this, in the client organisations NZTA and KiwiRail, and in the delivery organisation Nectar itself. The Kaikoura experience also for me highlighted the benefits of being able to draw on a number of people across the country that have recent and appropriate disaster response experience. It also made it very apparent to me that having systems and procedures and tools that you could use that have been developed elsewhere in the heat of disaster recovery is hugely beneficial. So in my mind, it makes sense that harnessing hard-learned experience will enable improvements in performance. Following this logic, a group of people from Canterbury have got together and identified that there are some real opportunities to learn and to intentionally improve outcomes for the community in the way we do things. I want to briefly discuss one initiative. A group of Cantabrians, including a lot of engineers, have decided to have a go at doing something different, not waiting for someone else to make it happen, but to just get on with it. We believe that we can harness some of the learnings that we've talked about tonight to build relationships ahead of an event, to create connections between community and stakeholders and government before an event, to develop clever ways to get things done, and even to train people on how to work together. The aim is to enable a rapid response should another event occur. So working with Quake Centre, Canterbury University, the team have developed a concept of creating a not-for-profit organisation that brings together New Zealand's people and systems to enable communities to rebuild after disaster. The organisation, which is called Engage, aims to harness lessons learned, to link a network of people across the nation together so that we can assist local government, central government and the communities in responding when another event does happen. And I think the odds are that it's going to happen. The team are currently working with government, with industry and other stakeholder organisations to share knowledge and gain an aligned understanding of how best to work together. It's planned that Engage will provide access to experienced people, disaster response teams that can then assist and train people to own and drive their own recovery. It's not about going in and doing everything for people, it's about going and assisting them and acting as a catalyst. So Engage is an example, as I said, of New Zealanders choosing to get out of their armchairs, away from their computers and phones, to stand up as leaders in their communities and influence future outcomes. On your way out tonight, there'll be some people from Engage you can talk to. If not, get onto the email. Now that advertisement's over, I'll get back into where I'm talking about. So I mentioned earlier that I had seen behaviour in people in the community towards their neighbours, their friends, and even strangers change to being a lot more generous with their time, resources, and friendship post-earthquake. And I think most people who were in Christchurch would have seen that. Unfortunately, I also noticed that over time, as we moved from recovery into response, as the community transitioned into recovery themselves, people seemed to revert back to pre-earthquake behaviours. The overwhelmingly generous support for neighbours, friends and even strangers, as well as the random acts of kindness that we were seeing across the city, actually diminished and seemed to be less frequent and far less obvious. As the majority of the community recovered, those that were not recovered yet were almost left on their own, and I dare say there's some people still living with this. I wondered at the time that I was putting this lecture together whether it was possible to actually intentionally engage with society, with our communities, to stimulate the generosity of spirit that I'd seen post-disaster, so that it became the new norm. I reasoned with myself that it was possible, but understood that it was probably going to take a lot of effort. Okay, so as I stand here tonight, what have I learned? What have we all learned? I'm convinced that we, human beings, are naturally inclined to be relational beings, to enjoy the company of other people. I believe that we thrive in a community context and are at our very best when we focus on others ahead of ourselves. I also believe that it's only a choice that stands between us and others from actually choosing to make a difference and becoming to respond in a civic manner, thinking of others first. Ultimately, it's about collaborating with the many in service of the best solution for the greater community, for society. Lastly, I just think that we all can choose to be leaders in our communities rather than sitting back and leaving it to others to do something about it. We live in a society that's strongly impacted by the leaders in our political framework. I'm not talking at you, Raf. We're lucky that we have the right to freely elect our leaders. But I contend that once we elect them, we just leave them to get on with it, and we become really good at sitting in our chairs and whinging about what's being done. I wonder whether we're relying on them too much to shape the future of our society. I'm not convinced that the thoughts of a few that lead can match the collective creativity of individuals that make up society. Perhaps there are opportunities for ourselves to engage with others, to impact what's going on in society ourselves. Let's consider for a moment, what could we do differently? Do we need to do anything different? Are we as society or as our elected leaders even addressing the right issues or problems? Do we as the community have access to the right data and facts that can inform appropriate community debate and conversation? Are decisions being made based on fact or perception or political ideology or personal preference? Are we dealing with what's happening today and tomorrow instead of looking at 10 and 15 years out? Are we, the community, actually engaging in any conversation? Or are we sitting at home watching telly and not even knowing who our neighbour is? Are we even in the conversation? I wonder about our leaders. Are they really aligned with the communities, with what the community aspires to? Are they listening to feedback? Are we giving any opportunity to receive feedback? Do our leaders intentionally engage with us, the community, to give us sound logic and reasoning for decisions made? Do we actually have enough two-way conversation? My oldest son lives in Norway with his wife and 2 kids. And he tells me that on a regular basis, people from Cabinet come and sit down with community groups and they have a full day or half day open conversation and dialogue about what's on their mind, what's important, what do they see as important for the future. Can we do some of this stuff? Can we hold our politicians and our elected leaders to account more? Do we need to rate their performance and stick it up in a newspaper or something? I just got to look in the Australian political environment at the moment. And you think, where are the statesmen and stateswomen that are leading our countries, looking generations ahead instead of the next election cycle? Have we actually got the right incentive to draw the right people into being our leaders? I believe every human has something to offer. We do need to wonder, are we creating a society that does reflect and recognise everyone's worth? Do we need to do something different as a society or a community? Or are we comfortable that this is as good as it gets? Are we making effective use of the talent, the skills, the abilities of the people in our communities? And if we're not satisfied, what can we do about it? And who's going to do it? I see a view out in society where people are just happy to leave it to other people to get on and do stuff. I suggest that we in this room are all in a perfect position to make a difference. I contend that we're only limited by our desire to do so, by our imagination, by the focus of our energy and will. Collectively or individually, we, the community, can choose to bring about change without waiting for someone else to do it or for an earthquake to come along and make it happen. I reckon we can create the society that we desire and we deserve. So perhaps the challenge tonight is for all of us. to think about standing up as leaders in our communities, to be civic leaders in our own right. Perhaps the civil engineering profession needs to be thinking more about standing up and leading in this time. Who knows what we can achieve when we choose to act for our communities using collaboration and communication. I don't have the answers, but I do know that if we do not take the time to actually stop and bring some of these conversations into the community forum and at least talk about them, then nothing's going to change. And how will we explain that to our children and grandchildren? Thank you.